Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we bring you a chilling and twisted tale, one of betrayal, deception, and a deadly obsession. This is the story of the real Goodfellas, inside the life of the Lucchese crime family. A tale of loyalty, corruption, and unimaginable violence. This case will leave you wondering, what does it take to rise to the top of the criminal underworld? And what happens when loyalty is betrayed? Stay with us as we unravel the dark and tragic story of the Lucchese crime family. The story of the Lucchese crime family, one of the most powerful and dangerous mafia organizations in New York, begins with the American dream, albeit twisted, dark version of it. It starts with an immigrant's hunger for survival and ambition, growing from the gritty streets of early 20th century New York. And at the heart of it all was Tommy Lucchese, a man who would rise from poverty to control the city's underworld. Tommy Lucchese was born in 1911 in Sicily, in a small village where life was hard, and every man had to carve out his place in a world governed by violence and poverty. Like many other young men in his homeland, he learned quickly that survival meant learning to use both his fists and his mind. The world he came from was harsh, but it was in the streets of New York where Tommy would truly begin to understand the ways of power. In 1920, when Tommy was still just a teenager, his family immigrated to America. They settled in the chaotic, overcrowded neighborhoods of Brooklyn, New York. It was a city teeming with immigrants, many of whom sought refuge from the poverty and strife of their homelands. But while New York was a land of opportunity for some, it was a battleground for many others. It was here that Tommy's journey into the criminal underworld began. At first, Tommy tried to live a normal life, working menial jobs to support his family. But the lure of easy money and respect was impossible to resist. Like many young men in his position, he quickly found his way into the world of crime. It wasn't long before Tommy had become involved in street-level rackets, loan sharking, extortion, and petty theft. But unlike the others, Tommy had something more than just street smarts. He had an innate understanding of human nature. He could read people like an open book, knowing when to make a deal and when to threaten. In a world where loyalty was everything, Tommy had a unique ability to manipulate people to get what he wanted without the violence that often came with the mafia's reputation. By the mid-1930s, Tommy had caught the eye of the bigger players in the criminal world. It was during this time that he began to work for a local crime boss named Gaetano Tommy Gagliano. Gagliano was a seasoned mafia don with a vast network of influence across the city. He recognized Tommy's intelligence and ambition, and it wasn't long before Tommy became one of Gagliano's trusted men. However, it wasn't just Gagliano's reputation that Tommy sought to align himself with. It was the family structure. The mafia was built on loyalty, trust, and a strict code of conduct. The deeper Tommy moved into the world of organized crime, the more he saw that this code wasn't just a way of life, it was a shield. It was the only thing that protected you from the chaos of the streets and the constant threat of betrayal. As Tommy's role grew within Gagliano's organization, he began to learn the intricate politics of the mafia. It wasn't just about being tough, it was about understanding how to build and maintain alliances, how to balance power and fear, and how to stay one step ahead of both the law and your rivals. Tommy had an innate knack for this. He was a natural-born strategist, calculating every move, never rushing into things, and always keeping his enemies guessing. But while Tommy's ambition grew, so did his understanding of the fragile nature of loyalty in the mafia. It was in the late 1930s that he learned a hard lesson. A rival family seeking to expand its territory attempted to take over Gagliano's operation. The conflict quickly escalated, and the violence that followed was brutal. In one of the bloodiest showdowns in New York's underworld, Gagliano's faction barely survived, but it was clear that Tommy's survival instincts were far sharper than those of his peers. During this time, Tommy witnessed betrayal from the very people who were supposed to be his allies. A trusted capo within Gagliano's family had secretly been working with the rival faction, and when he was caught, the repercussions were swift and brutal. It was a grim reminder of the true nature of the criminal world. Trust was as fragile as the thin air in the alleyways, and betrayal could come from anywhere. It was Tommy's cold and calculating approach that helped him survive in this world of constant danger. After the conflict with the rival family subsided, Tommy began to make his own moves. His rise within the Gagliano family was quick, and soon he became one of the top men in the organization. He was promoted to consigliere, a key role that placed him right at the center of the family's operations. However, Tommy's vision was always larger than just being a trusted advisor. He wanted more. He had seen how quickly power could be consolidated and how it could be lost in the blink of an eye. He knew that in order to achieve his dream of dominating New York's criminal world, he would have to outmaneuver everyone around him. By the late 1940s, Tommy had begun laying the groundwork for his own ascent to power. As Gagliano grew older, his influence waned, and it was clear that a new generation was ready to take charge. Tommy, having built a network of loyal followers and allies, moved decisively. In 1951, when Gagliano died, Tommy was ready. He quickly maneuvered his way to the top, securing control of the organization that would soon be known as the Lucchese Crime Family. Under Tommy's leadership, the family would go from being a regional player to one of the most powerful crime syndicates in New York. Tommy was smart, ruthless, and incredibly patient. He understood that true power didn't come from violence alone, it came from the ability to control the flow of money and influence. Under his reign, the Lucchese family expanded into every profitable criminal enterprise, from labor racketeering to the burgeoning casino business. But as the family grew, so did the risks. In the world of organized crime, there were always those waiting to betray, to undermine, and to rise up. Tommy knew this. And while his control over the Lucchese family seemed unshakable, the game was far from over. The streets of New York would soon witness the next chapter in the Lucchese family saga, a chapter written in blood, betrayal, and power. By the time the 1950s rolled around, the Lucchese crime family had transformed from a small-time operation into a juggernaut in New York's criminal world. Under Tommy Lucchese's leadership, the family had carved out a niche in nearly every illicit business, from labor racketeering to loan sharking, extortion, and even the booming construction industry. With this newfound power, however, came an inevitable consequence: enemies. The rise of the Lucchese family did not go unnoticed. It didn't take long before the other mafia families, the Genovese, Gambino, and Colombo families, began to take notice of Tommy's growing influence. These families, each with their own powerful leaders, controlled vast territories in the city, and none of them was willing to let the Lucchese family dominate without a fight. The tension in New York was palpable. Every day the underworld simmered with hostility. Rivalries had always existed between the families, but the increasing wealth and influence of the Lucchese family had made them a target. The city, already a powder keg of crime and corruption, was now primed for a full-scale war. Tommy Lucchese, ever the strategist, understood that outright war could bring the authorities down on all the families. The media, the police, and the FBI had been growing more aggressive in their pursuit of organized crime, and Tommy knew that if all the families went to war, it would expose them to greater risks. So he took a different approach, one that was calculated and cold. The Lucchese family entered what would become known as the Silent War. Unlike the loud, bloody confrontations that had marked earlier mafia conflicts, this war was fought in the shadows, with precision and quiet brutality. The battle lines were drawn, but the weapons were not guns or bombs, they were the subtle tools of sabotage, intimidation, and manipulation. At the center of this conflict was a key figure, Paul Vario, a rising star within the Lucchese family. Vario, a product of Brooklyn's tough streets, was an enforcer and intimidating figure who was as skilled at negotiation as he was at violence. He had quickly risen through the ranks under Tommy's watchful eye, and now he was tasked with managing some of the family's most lucrative operations. Vario's loyalty to Tommy was unquestioned, but loyalty in the mafia was often as fragile as glass. There was always the lure of more power, more money, and more respect. Vario was no different. He had long ago made peace with the fact that in the criminal world, nothing came without a price, and betrayal was often just a stepping stone to success. But he was also intelligent enough to know that, for the moment, the Lucchese family was his best chance at ascending the mafia ladder. However, there was one thing Vario hadn't counted on: the growing ambition of others around him. As the silent war raged on, Vario found himself increasingly at odds with certain members of the family. Some of them, less patient and more volatile, believed Tommy's methods were too cautious. They wanted bloodshed, wanted to show the other families that the Lucchese would not back down. But Tommy was no fool. He had been in the game long enough to understand that patience, when applied correctly, could yield better results than rash violence. He knew that if the Lucchese family made too much noise, they risked bringing down the full wrath of law enforcement and tipping the delicate balance of power they had so carefully built. So, Tommy worked in silence, pulling strings behind the scenes while Vario and others fought a quiet war on the streets. The tactics were ruthless. Rival businesses were sabotaged, competitors were blackmailed, and families were intimidated into silence. Tommy's network of informants and loyalists helped him control the flow of information, making it nearly impossible for his enemies to anticipate his next move. Even within his own ranks, there were whispers, but no one dared to speak too loudly. To do so was to risk becoming a target. Meanwhile, on the streets, Vario's enforcers dealt with the rival families. Rather than engaging in open warfare, the Lucchese utilized strategic hits, covert assassinations, car bombings that looked like accidents, and disappearances that left no trace. The goal was to send a message: you will not outlast us, and you will not make a move without our knowledge. The silent war also saw a growing tension within the Gambino family, led by the volatile Carlo Gambino. Though the Gambinos were often seen as the most powerful of the five families, they had been weakened by a series of internal struggles and power grabs. Tommy saw an opportunity in this chaos, and he played it with masterful precision. His agents fed false information to Gambino's lieutenants, making them believe that their allies in the Genovese family were plotting against them. Meanwhile, the Genovese family, aware of the rising tension, began to edge away from Gambino, creating even more confusion. The result was a powder keg, one that Tommy Lucchese had carefully set up, with rival families fighting each other's shadows instead of focusing on the real threat. As the silent war continued, Tommy Lucchese solidified his position at the top without ever firing a single shot at his rivals. But the toll was heavy. The constant game of manipulation and deception took its toll on the Lucchese family itself. Vario, increasingly ambitious and restless, began to question Tommy's cautious approach. He believed that they could push harder, strike faster, and expand their territory into more profitable areas, such as the burgeoning Las Vegas casino scene. However, Tommy's approach was always one of steady, calculated control. He had no interest in rushing into something that could unravel their entire empire. And so, as Vario's ambitions began to grow, so did his resentment. The silent war was no longer just about power struggles with rival families. It was also becoming a battle for dominance within the Lucchese family itself. Vario, once one of Tommy's most trusted men, started to question whether loyalty was really worth the sacrifice. After all, in the world of the Mafia, even the closest of allies could be replaced when they became a liability. But Tommy knew the importance of loyalty and how quickly it could turn to betrayal. The silent war was about more than just territory. It was about controlling the hearts and minds of the men who were closest to you. If Tommy could maintain control of his family through this delicate balance of power, he would emerge victorious. But if he lost even one ollie, the consequences could be catastrophic. The war was far from over, but Tommy was more determined than ever to win it quietly, strategically, and with an iron fist behind a velvet glove. By the early 1960s, the Lucchese crime family had reached its zenith. Under Tommy Lucchese's steady hand, it had expanded its operations from New York streets into legitimate businesses, including construction, the garment industry, and even trucking. The family was thriving in ways that few other mafia families could match. But as the saying goes, the higher you climb, the harder you fall. And with success came risks, particularly the ever-present danger of betrayal. Tommy had built his empire on strategy, patience, and loyalty. He surrounded himself with men who were, for the most part, loyal to him and the Lucchese family. But loyalty, in the world of organized crime, was always a double-edged sword. And Tommy, despite his sharp instincts, would soon learn that even the most trusted allies could be swayed by greed, ambition, or simply a better offer. The tension began when a younger, more ambitious member of the family, Anthony Tony Vario, the son of Paul Vario, began making his own power moves. Tony Vario was a skilled businessman and a natural leader, quickly rising within the ranks of the family. However, while his father, Paul, remained loyal to Tommy, young Tony's ambitions began to clash with his loyalty. He wasn't content with simply running rackets or overseeing the family's day-to-day activities. He wanted more. He wanted to be at the top. The seeds of betrayal were planted when Tony started aligning himself with powerful figures outside the Lucchese family. He sought out connections with other crime families, particularly the Genovese family, which had long been a rival of the Luccheses. Tony saw the Genovese as a potential ally, someone who could offer him the power and resources he needed to take down Tommy and assume control of the family himself. And while Tony was careful not to overstep, he began to secretly undermine his father's authority in the family by feeding information to the Genovese, subtly eroding trust between the two families. Tony's betrayal didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, gradual process. At first, it was just whispers and rumors. Tony was careful not to make any sudden moves, but he began to make the right connections, attend the right meetings, and voice his discontent with Tommy's cautious, old-school approach to leadership. He felt that Tommy was holding back the family, preventing it from expanding into new, more lucrative areas like the casinos in Las Vegas, a potential goldmine that was rapidly becoming the new frontier in the mafia world. Tommy, however, was no fool. He had been in the game long enough to recognize the subtle signs of discontent in his ranks. He noticed that Tony was becoming increasingly distant, absent from important family meetings, and associating with men outside the family. Tommy had always believed that in the mafia world, you could never fully trust anyone. But he also knew that the appearance of betrayal was sometimes just as dangerous as the act itself. In the spring of 1963, Tommy received a tip from an informant within the Genovese family. The informant, a low-level associate who had fallen out of favor with his own family, revealed that Tony had been meeting with Genovese capos and discussing plans to take over the Lucchese family. According to the informant, Tony had made promises of greater power and wealth, offering the Genovese a foothold in the family's operations in exchange for support in his bid to oust Tommy. The news hit Tommy like a thunderbolt. He had seen betrayals before, but never from someone so close to him. Tony was more than just a trusted lieutenant. He was the son of one of Tommy's closest allies, Paul Vario. The betrayal felt personal, and it threatened to destroy the very foundation of everything Tommy had worked for. Tommy, however, wasn't one to react impulsively. His first instinct was to gather information, to confirm the truth of the allegations before making any decisions. He couldn't afford to make a mistake, not when the stakes were so high. The Lucchese family had worked hard to carve out its place in the world, and Tommy wasn't about to let a traitor destroy it. As he investigated further, Tommy began to realize the full extent of Tony's betrayal. It wasn't just about ambition. Tony had gone behind his back to orchestrate a covert deal with the Genovese family, promising them a share of the family's most lucrative operations in exchange for their support. Tommy's businesses in construction, trucking, and garment manufacturing were worth millions, and the Genovese knew that if they could gain control over those operations, they would have a direct line into the city's economy. Tommy was now faced with a decision: how to deal with the betrayal. He knew that Tony's actions couldn't be allowed to slide. But he also understood that this wasn't just about Tony, it was about maintaining control over the Lucchese family and ensuring that no one, no matter how powerful, could challenge his authority. The solution was both simple and brutal. Tony had to be dealt with swiftly. Tommy called a meeting with Paul Vario, Tony's father, and informed him of his son's treachery. Paul was devastated. He had always been a loyal soldier to Tommy, and the thought that his own son had turned against him was a blow he could hardly comprehend. But Paul understood the nature of the world they lived in. There was no room for weakness, no space for emotions when it came to loyalty. Tommy knew that Paul would never turn against his own son, but he also knew that Paul would understand the necessity of maintaining order within the family. After all, if a man like Tony Vario could betray the boss, then no one in the family would be safe. It was a lesson in power and survival, a lesson that, if left unaddressed, could tear the family apart. With Paul's reluctant agreement, Tommy set the plan in motion. On a quiet summer night in 1964, Tony Vario was lured to a meeting under the pretense of resolving the conflict with Tommy. The meeting was arranged in a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Tony arrived expecting a negotiation, but instead, he found himself face to face with Tommy's enforcers. In the world of organized crime, there was no second chance for betrayal. Tony's fate had been sealed the moment he had aligned himself with the Genovese family. As the life drained from him in that dimly lit warehouse, Tommy Lucchese sent a powerful message to his family: loyalty is everything. Cross me, and you will pay the price. The betrayal was over, but its impact was far-reaching. It left a scar within the family that would never fully heal, and it marked the beginning of a darker, more ruthless phase in the Lucchese crime family's history. Tommy had survived this betrayal, but he knew that more were likely to come. In the criminal world, power was fleeting, and the price of maintaining it was often too high. And so, Tommy Lucchese's reign continued, tempered by the knowledge that betrayal was always lurking just around the corner, waiting for the right moment to strike. By the mid-1960s, Tommy Lucchese had solidified his position as one of the most powerful mafia bosses in New York. His empire stretched across several lucrative industries: construction, labor unions, trucking, and even the burgeoning Las Vegas casino scene. The Lucchese family had become a well-oiled machine, its operations running smoothly under Tommy's careful leadership. But despite his success, Tommy knew that nothing in the world of organized crime lasted forever. The same ambition that had driven him to the top now became a threat to his empire, and it came from an unlikely source. While Tommy's rule was based on subtlety, control, and strategic alliances, the next generation of mafia members wasn't content to operate in the shadows. The younger members, like his underboss, Paul Vario's son, and others like Salvatore Sally D'Ambrosio, were eager to expand their influence and take risks that Tommy himself would never have entertained. This rising generation wanted more than just a piece of the pie; they wanted the whole bakery. By now, the mafia was in transition. The old guard was being replaced by new, younger men who were more inclined to take daring risks, operate more violently, and control territories that Tommy had once carefully kept out of reach. These young men were becoming more vocal, more impatient. They saw Tommy's carefully measured approach as outdated and timid. The world of organized crime was changing, and they wanted to change with it. The emergence of these younger figures in the family highlighted the brewing discontent within the Lucchese ranks. Though Tommy had done his best to keep the family united, cracks were beginning to show. At first, it was subtle: a few grumbling whispers during meetings, a few disagreements over how to handle certain operations. But soon it became clear that the real threat to Tommy's power wasn't external, it was internal. Salvatore Sally D'Ambrosio was one of the key figures in this growing unrest. D'Ambrosio had a reputation for being ruthless and calculating, and he had dreams of one day leading the family himself. He began to make his own alliances, both within and outside of the Lucchese family, quietly working behind Tommy's back to build his influence. His connections with other mafia families, especially the Genovese family, put him in a dangerous position. The more powerful he became, the more he attracted the attention of those who would stop at nothing to see him replace Tommy as the head of the Lucchese family. For a time, Tommy wasn't fully aware of just how dangerous the situation was becoming. He had always relied on his ability to read people, to sense when something was off. But this time, the rising unrest wasn't immediately visible. The young generation had learned to be patient and subtle, unlike the brash members of previous generations who had fought in the streets and made their moves in the open. This new breed of mafia men understood that in the modern world, power was won not by brute force, but by influence, money, and intelligence. By 1967, Tommy Lucchese's reign began to fray at the edges. His health was starting to deteriorate as well. Though he was only in his mid-50s, the stress of running the Lucchese empire was taking a toll. He'd always been a hard worker, a man who believed that nothing should ever be left to chance, but the constant need to stay ahead of his rivals and keep the family together wore on him. He was no longer the energetic, calculating young man who had first come to America seeking survival. He was now an aging boss with more enemies than ever before, both within his own ranks and beyond. The real turning point came in the form of a federal investigation that targeted the Lucchese family's operations. In the late 1960s, the FBI began to ramp up its efforts to take down the mafia, launching a series of wiretaps and surveillance operations aimed at cracking down on organized crime. The Lucchese family was under the microscope, and Tommy, despite his ability to evade law enforcement for years, could feel the pressure building. The investigation led to the arrest of several high-ranking members of the Lucchese family, many of whom had been involved in more than just the traditional rackets. There were whispers of ties to more dangerous operations: drug trafficking, money laundering, and even the emerging world of organized gambling outside the U.S. As the investigation escalated, it became clear that the family's criminal activities were attracting more attention than ever before. And the worst part was that one of the main informants against the family was someone on the inside, a longtime associate who had been close to Tommy for years. Tommy's paranoia grew. The sense of betrayal within the family began to feel like a tidal wave crashing toward him. The thought of his own men turning against him in such a public way, especially under the spotlight of the FBI, was too much to bear. He knew that betrayal was always lurking in the world of organized crime, but he had trusted too many of these men for it to come to this. The pressure from the authorities wasn't the only threat he faced. Sally D'Ambrosio's power was growing, and rumors circulated that he had begun making deals with the FBI himself, hoping to turn state's evidence in exchange for leniency. The thought that one of his own could be working with the government was enough to drive Tommy into a state of frenzy. He began to question everyone around him, wondering if his empire would crumble from within. In 1969, Tommy's worst fears came true. A trusted confidant of many years, someone he had considered a son, had been flipping under pressure from the FBI. His name was Frank the Beast Bellini, a muscleman who had been working as an enforcer for the Lucchese family. Bellini had turned on Tommy and provided the authorities with enough information to secure a major blow to the family's operations. He had helped the FBI with their surveillance efforts and led them to key locations where illegal activities were being carried out. The arrest of Bellini was the final straw. Tommy, devastated by the betrayal of someone he had trusted, knew that the end was near. His health, already fragile, deteriorated rapidly after the news broke. Stress and paranoia clouded his judgment. He realized that he had underestimated the ambition of the younger generation, and now his empire was on the verge of collapse. As Tommy's health failed, the family was left in a state of chaos. D'Ambrosio made his move, solidifying his position as the new boss. But the family that Tommy had worked so hard to build was no longer his. The silent war had morphed into an open battle for control, and the new generation was determined to rewrite the rules. Tommy Lucchese, once the king of the Mafia, had reached the twilight of his reign. His fall was slow, painful, and filled with the bitterness of betrayal. As he sat in his final days, reflecting on his legacy, one thing became clear in the world of organized crime: nothing, absolutely nothing, was ever permanent. The decline of Tommy Lucchese marked the end of an era for the Lucchese crime family. As his health deteriorated and his influence waned, the once mighty empire he had built began to fracture. The younger generation, eager to assert their power, saw the moment as their opportunity to seize control. In the end, it was a vicious battle that would shape the future of the family and leave a legacy fraught with betrayal, ambition, and power struggles. After Tommy's passing in 1967, the Lucchese family, led by his chosen successor, Carmine the Beast Romano, faced turbulent waters. Romano, a longtime loyalist to Tommy, assumed the role of boss, but his leadership was quickly challenged by those who had grown impatient with the old guard. The conflict between the traditionalists and the up-and-comers in the family created a rift that would take years to heal. The family was at a crossroads. On one hand, there were those like Paul Vario, who had once been one of Tommy's closest allies. Despite his son Tony's betrayal and the subsequent fallout, Paul remained fiercely loyal to Tommy's vision of the family. However, there were also figures like Salvatore Sally D'Ambrosio, who represented the new breed of mafia leadership. D'Ambrosio's rise had been swift, driven by his ruthless ambition, and his growing influence in the family was undeniable. The battle for control between Romano and D'Ambrosio grew increasingly bitter. Romano, who had inherited Tommy's cautious and strategic approach to leadership, was outmatched by D'Ambrosio's raw ambition and willingness to use violence to achieve his goals. D'Ambrosio had learned from his predecessors, but he wasn't afraid to make bold moves to cement his place at the top. He began making deals with other mafia families, particularly the powerful Genovese family, to bolster his standing. This put him in direct conflict with Romano, whose more conservative approach to alliances and operations had earned him the respect of some of the family's elders, but had alienated the younger, more ambitious members. The tensions between Romano and D'Ambrosio came to a head in 1970 when D'Ambrosio orchestrated a brutal attack on one of Romano's key lieutenants. The hit, which was carried out in broad daylight on the streets of Brooklyn, sent a clear message D'Ambrosio was willing to go to any lengths to seize control of the family. Romano, though shocked by the audacity of the attack, knew that he could not let this challenge go unanswered. The conflict between the two men escalated quickly, leading to a series of violent confrontations and power struggles that would spill over into the streets of New York. The situation reached its tipping point when the FBI, ever watchful of the mafia's activities, began to close in on the Lucchese family. With the family divided and the law enforcement pressure mounting, it seemed that the Lucchese empire might collapse under its own weight. But the infighting had a surprising effect. It united the two factions of the family against a common enemy, the federal government. In 1971, a federal task force, led by the FBI and the Department of Justice, launched a full-scale investigation into the Lucchese family's operations. The task force had been gathering intelligence for months, and with the family in disarray, the authorities believed they had a chance to strike at the heart of the organization. Wiretaps, surveillance, and informants within the family provided a treasure trove of evidence, and for the first time in years, the Lucchese family seemed vulnerable. But just as the FBI was preparing to make their move, a sudden and unexpected shift occurred within the family. In a shocking act of betrayal, Paul Vario, the elder statesman of the Lucchese family, made a decision that would change the course of the family's future. Paul, who had long been regarded as one of Tommy's most loyal allies, made a deal with the FBI. He became an informant, providing crucial information that would lead to the downfall of several top members of the family, including D'Ambrosio. The revelation that Paul had flipped sent shockwaves through the mafia world. The Lucchese family, already weakened by internal power struggles, now faced an existential crisis. The betrayal of one of the most respected men in the family was a blow from which the family would never recover. Paul's decision to cooperate with the authorities was a move that many viewed as the final act of a dying empire. His loyalty to Tommy had been unwavering, but in his later years he had become disillusioned with the violence and bloodshed that had consumed the family. With Paul's cooperation, the FBI launched a series of raids that decimated the leadership of the Lucchese family. Key figures, including D'Ambrosio, were arrested, tried, and convicted on a range of charges. The family's influence in New York began to fade, and the once proud crime syndicate became a shell of its former self. The Lucchese family, which had once controlled vast swaths of New York City, was now splintered and fractured, its power greatly diminished. But even as the Lucchese family crumbled, the legacy of Tommy Lucchese's empire continued to cast a long shadow over the mafia world. His rise to power, his strategic brilliance, and his ability to build alliances had set the standard for future generations of mafia bosses. Though his reign had ended in betrayal and bloodshed, Tommy's name was still synonymous with power and success. His story was one that would be told in whispered conversations in the back rooms of mafia clubs and during quiet meetings in smoke-filled bars. As the years passed, the Lucchese family continued to exist, albeit in a diminished state. Though they no longer controlled the streets with the same iron grip, the family still had its hands in various criminal enterprises. The name Lucchese was no longer synonymous with dominance, but it was still feared. The old guard was gone, but the younger generation had learned much from Tommy's playbook. They understood that survival in the mafia world wasn't just about brute force, it was about influence, alliances, and knowing when to strike. In the end, the Lucchese crime family, like all empires, had been built on a foundation of betrayal, ambition, and power. The rise and fall of Tommy Lucchese had left an indelible mark on the world of organized crime. His story, full of highs and lows, would serve as a cautionary tale for anyone who dared to follow in his footsteps. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the dark world of the Lucchese crime family. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Mystery Minds for more true crime documentaries. Remember, in the world of the mafia, nothing is ever